Andrey Buzarov is a freelance journalist, a political advisor, and an expert on international relations. He's in the UK at the moment, looking to expand his network to advocate for Ukraine and to understand how Western support for Ukraine could be strengthened and to ensure that we stay with Ukraine for the duration until their victory is achieved. So, Andrey, did Putin launch his military operation based on poor information and poor intelligence?
Exactly. I think, Jonathan, that the biggest problem and biggest error, mistake, not only personal by Putin, but all his colleagues and ruling elite in Russia, were the misunderstanding of the real potential of civil society, of the strengths of our president personally, and also of the people of Ukraine. So I think he did not collect, or maybe some gave him wrong information about the situation, about these peculiarities, about the possible activity of Zelensky, about the civil society, about the other things. And I think one of the biggest mistake was we were actually not understanding what is Ukraine now.
Given those mistakes, did Putin believe, actually, that the Ukrainian government, the military, and the security services had been penetrated by his agents, his assets? Did he perhaps also believe that Zelensky and his government would run away at the first sign of trouble?
Well, it's a quite complicated question because, on the other hand, there were so many, a lot of different politicians, businessmen, who feel affiliated officially and publicly with Russia in the sector of industry, of business, politically. So it was so obvious on the eve of the first war. First war, it means the war, the first phase of aggression in 2014. It was so obvious on the eve of the second war, which started last year in February 2022. However, for majority of the society, it was not quite understandable why so many politicians in Ukraine were connected with Russia. Nobody paid attention on this. Concerning the agents, the secret agents, I think, they had a lot of people historically after the collapse of Soviet Union. I think there are a lot of people still, not still, but will continuing to work with them, and that's why I think that these factors, the political factor of some allies from the political system of Ukraine and the agents who were in Ukraine after the collapse of Soviet Union, this complex of the factors was used by ruling elite in Russia and personally by Putin to prepare political background for the second phase of aggression, for the full-scale invasion, I would say.
And given the period of time that elapsed between the initial invasion and the subsequent one, you say that Russia was preparing all along for this step. So is it incorrect to ask whether communications broke down with Russia and the West? Is there in fact anything the West could have done to prevent the full-scale war?
I think they had a plan, and he had a plan concerning concerning Ukraine. And my personal opinion, in my opinion, I think that Russia prepared the first phase of aggression in 2014. They initiated the process and then they made a pause. So they were preparing for the next phase for many years, actually 8 years. Because if you analyze what was happening in occupied territories, in Crimea, in Lugansk and Donetsk region, in the occupied regions of east of Ukraine, Donbass, you would see that they were preparing for the next actually phase of invasion. That's why it wasn't so surprising for me personally, for the men originally from Donetsk, and for a lot of soldiers who were in Ukrainian army after the first invasion. So it was so obvious that the next phase were inevitable. Inevitable. It's very important to understand. That's why I think that the this period, the 8 year period, was used by Russians just to prepare for the next phase, and but they failed. This is for them, it was very surprise, a big, huge surprise, but they failed, and this is actually also very important indicator of their misunderstanding of Ukraine.
Now, it's interesting you mention that because one of the propaganda narratives given by Putin, and in fact, I still get this written on the channel by trolls almost every day, is that the invasion was conducted because Russia needed to come in and protect Russian speakers, needed to protect them from genocide, from the suppression of their language, their identity, their literature. How true is this?
Actually, I think this factor, this pretext, is very formal and artificial, and they used mostly it for their own domestic audience, because the Russian-speaking people in Moldova, Russian-speaking people in Latvia, Russian-speaking people in Lithuania, partly in Estonia, and for example in Tajikistan, even in Kazakhstan. It's very important because the majority of Russian-speaking people outside of Russia, except Ukraine, living actually in Kazakhstan. So in the other countries in post-Soviet space, it's a very artificial and not understand. The people actually out of Russia don't understand what does it mean defend Russian-speaking person. So it's mostly oriented to the domestic, domestic citizen, domestic politics, I would say, in Russian Federation, because the problems which were concerning the language in Moldova, in Ukraine, and other countries, it's a domestic question of these countries, which should be resolved by the politicians, by the society, during the social impact, during the communication, during the other things, but inside the country, not but by outside. So I think it's a formal pretext, and actually it's very hard to find examples when and who during the last 100 years or after the Second World War used this pretext for their such kind of terrible atrocities and crimes.
The way you describe it, it sounds like this is part of a big plan, not something that was cooked up on the spur of the moment. So is this war more about imperial ambitions? Is it about internal Russian politics, genocide, land, or resources?
Exactly. You know, Jonathan, you know Ukraine and post-Soviet space very good. But I was asked the same question during the conference in Friedrichshafen in Germany 4 months ago. The same question when I made the speech about the Russian propaganda. And I said officially they use two pretexts, two reasons for full-scale invasion. They're defending, so-called defending the people of Donbass and the NATO factor. But in practice, we see and we saw the neo-imperial or neo-Soviet ambitions to use Ukraine as a factor to expand military, economically, potential, but politically, the influence in the post-Soviet space. For me, for the PhD researcher in social philosophy and philosophy in history, it's so obvious. However, a lot of people still don't understand that Ukraine could be, well, theoretically, one of the targets of the Putin's vision of the neo-Soviet system. That's why I think that the pretext for the war, even for Russians, for citizens of Russian Federation, was formal. The real aim, I think, is behind the official pretext, and it could be actually several different aims, but this is another topic.
Of course, that pretense was used by the Germans, by the Nazis, in carving up Central and Eastern Europe, and that's potentially the last time. Let's also then turn to the Donbass, because one of the key reasons for going into that area and in Crimea as well, that Russia gives at least, is to protect Russian speakers because they are oppressed, marginalized, second-class citizens. They even talked about genocide, but provided no evidence for that. You're from that area. Do any of those words fit how you or what you saw around you taking place?
It's a very, very interesting question because I can, for 100% say no. I didn't have any signs of such kind of things. But I was born in Soviet Union, but I don't remember Soviet Union. I was 7 years old when Soviet Union collapsed, and I went to the school when formally, officially, Soviet Union did not exist. So I don't remember the traditions of Soviet school in Ukraine. And for me, for the person for whom Russian language is a native language and the Ukrainian language is a second native language, understanding the Ukraine as an independent state, as a new political nation, was so obvious that I had an immunity to Russian propaganda. And that's why it's impossible to persuade me, even on the eve of the First War, because after the First War and between the First War and Second War, we saw the atrocities of Russians in the occupied territories. We saw what we were in occupied territories in Crimea and in Donbass. So we couldn't believe Russians and Russian propaganda about the idea of defense Russian-speaking people. But even on the eve of First War in 2014, for me, this explanation, some kind of explanation or justification of their invasion was not so persuasive. But there were some people, some part of the population, it's hard to calculate what were the amount and what is now the amount of supporting Putin's regime, I would say, who believed and who believed in such kind of propaganda on the eve of the first invasion and on the eve of second invasion. But it's a minority. It's not a majority. This is a very important thing.
And economically, if we turn to the Russian world and what it's done, is it true to say that it's Russian-speaking areas that have suffered the most physically, population has suffered the most, but also one of the arguments is that places like Donetsk and Luhansk were forgotten by Kiev. But again, speaking to people who remember prior to 2014, they say that the economy in Donetsk was incredibly vibrant, only second behind Kiev. So, I mean, do you remember what that was like? And can you comment on this propaganda narrative that somehow the East was abandoned by Kiev?
Absolutely. It was absolutely impossible to imagine that East was abandoned because East was part of Ukraine. And the Donetsk, Donbass region, the Lugansk region, Donetsk region were developed as an integral part of independent Ukraine. Donetsk and Lugansk were part of the economical system of Ukraine or political system of Ukraine. Yes, the people there maybe had and have some local traditions historically, but this is a regional diversity of any region in Ukraine. However, Donbass was, I remember Donbass on the eve of the Russian first invasion. I remember the European Football Championship in 2012. So I visited 5 matches in Donetsk, all matches actually, during the European Championship. And Donbass was on the eve of the economic growth due to Ukrainian connection with Ukraine. Not connection as an integral part, not because of the Russian Federation economical influence. So Donbass was prosperous region. Donbass were important region and prosperous region on the eve of the Russian invasion due to being part of the independent Ukraine, not due to some historical roots with Russian culture or other things. This is another part. but economically Donbass was part of Ukraine and is part of Ukraine, which is occupied by Russia.
But Crimea and Donbass now, under the safety umbrella of the Russian world, what's the economic situation like now in the occupied territories?
It's very complicated for me to estimate this situation correctly, accurately, because I don't have accurate figures. But if you compare what were in Donbass on the eve of the Russian invasion, what is now, if you compare even Crimea, because Russian propaganda always wants to use Crimea as an example of such kind of improvement and other things. But if you compare the values, the civil society development, the freedom, it's very important. The civil society, the freedom, the prosperous and the prosperity of the region in Crimea, in Donbass, in comparison, which were before Russian occupation. And now you will see how the difference is huge. That's why it's not correctly to give the Russian vision of situation, because they occupy the territories. They should explain what they do. I don't know what do they aim. But for me, as a Ukrainian citizen, all the activity, all the so-called improvement which they do in the occupied territories, and they did in the occupied territories in Crimea, is absolutely unacceptable, because this is part of Ukraine. They cannot improve something because they occupied it. This is ideological principle question and thing for me.
One of the other narratives that's put around, and I still see it repeated a lot on Twitter, for instance, and people trolling on my channel, and that is to say that the West is equally to blame for the breakdown of communications with Russia. But from what you've said, it sounds like they had a plan, and I don't know, is there anything the West could have done to have derailed or took them out of that plan?
Interesting question, especially regarding the majority of the ruling, or the representatives of the member of the families of the ruling elite in Russia were integrated with the West, especially with Great Britain, integrated by their own property, not politically, not economically. A lot of people from Russia tried to flee Russia and to live in Great Britain, in the United States, in the European Union, earning money in Russia. This is a very important thing, and they still try to do it, especially regarding the situation in the European Union. That's why I think that the cutting, as you said, the connection between some kind of lost in connection between West and Russia, it's very, very artificial, I would say, explanation of situation. The relations between Russia and West always were, even during the Soviet period. But the problem is that Russian population and the elite, and even liberal part of Russian society, were not fully integrated in the Western world. They always try to use the narratives of imperial country, of their vision, of their personal vision of situation. Look, for example, the situation with Crimea. A lot of people in Russian Federation, the citizens of Russia, did not recognize Crimea as a part of Ukraine after the annexation, after the occupation. So even the ordinary Russians thought and think maybe now that the Crimea is part of Russian Federation, which is not correct. So I think that the answer of the question, on your question, lies not in West. The key to understand the situation lies in Russia, and the vision of Russian society, of the West, is very, very strange, and even for me, not so obvious.
So rather than a failure of communication, is this war possibly a failure of deterrence on the part of the West?
I think that Putin had already some kind of plan, and it's useless to persuade him to do something different. I mean, all the efforts by European Union, by the West, to find some kind of consensus with Putin were absolutely useless during the many years. I don't believe that the some could happen which would prevent this terrible tragedy. I think that the Putin and his allies inside Russia had the plan, and I think they wanted to implement this plan even during the war in Georgia, in South Ossetia. It was just the beginning. So it was a plan actually, and they use the weakness, the reluctant behavior of the European Union, of the West elites, just to expand their own power. So answering your question, that I do not believe that the West could prevent such terrible scenario communicating or negotiating with Putin. This is my personal opinion.
Now, Ukraine is opting for a maximalist definition of victory. But in your terms, what would a full victory actually mean, and what would need to be true for it to be labeled as a victory?
Well, actually, on this question, I'm fully and totally agree with our president, with Zelensky. This is official position of Ukraine, but this official position of Zelensky concerning the restoration of territorial integrity and the compensation by Russia, the damages, is totally reflected the public opinion in Ukraine, as well as Boris Johnson. When he came in Ukraine last year, he actually reflected the public opinion of UK supporting Ukraine. That's why I think that the victory, the total full-scale victory, I would say, is a restoration of territorial integrity and other things which were declared by our president. So I don't believe that some of these conditions could be negotiable regarding the some concessions to Russians. I think the society will not understand it. Our Ukrainian society would not understand it.
Given that many of the people who perpetrated war crimes will have fled back to Russia, many even will have been killed, how do you think the prosecutions for war crimes should proceed?
First of all, I want to say that the crimes which were committed by the Russians in Ukraine and against Ukrainians should be analyzed from the beginning of the first aggression. We cannot collect the information about their crimes only since the last year. We have to understand what they were doing during the last 9 years in Crimea and Donbass. And the people who are responsible for all these crimes during the last almost 10 years, at least they should be all found. Their names should be found. Their crimes which were committed by them also should be became more became publicly known. And I think that it's not so important whether we could, from the juridic point of view. I am a lawyer in the past, and for me it's a principle to find all the criminals, but maybe we couldn't find all them, as well as Israeli security services couldn't find all the Nazi criminals after the Second World War. At least they tried to do it. So I think this is a principal question for our national security, to establish the majority of these people who are responsible for the terrible atrocities and crimes. Not only the high officials, the high officers, because the Nazi high officers were executed after the Nuremberg process, but a lot of people then were prosecuted who implemented the criminal orders by Nazi regime. So the people who implemented the criminal orders by Putin also should be found. This is a very important question concerning the children who were deported. by Russian authorities from the occupied territories. This is, I think, very decisive and very important test, some kind of for the West also. So we, the journalists, the public figures, we should attract the attention to this problem, because sometimes the people forget about this, and Russia always use the deportation as a weapon to implement their own politics in occupied territories. You remember the deportation of a lot of nations after the Second World War. You remember the deportation of Ukrainians in Kazakhstan, the deportation of a lot of people, intellectuals, in Siberia. So Russia can use the same methods against Ukrainians and against the children from the occupied territories.
Let's turn now to security. Of course, accession to NATO and EU may be important for Ukraine's future security, but does Ukraine also need to be self-sufficient in terms of its own defense in the long term?
You know that I would say that there are two questions in these questions. One question concerning the cooperation with our Western allies, with NATO, and the second question concerning our own capacity. It's there is interconnectivity between these two questions, and now certainly the military support from the United States, from UK, is very important for us. And I, as a citizen of Ukraine, as a political analyst, as a journalist, as a public figure, very grateful to United States, to all West countries, to UK for your help. It's so important for the survival of my country. It's so important for the future of the country. And the majority of the people, I think all the people in Ukraine appreciate this help from West. And I think that this help should strengthen the Ukraine as an independent military superpower. Yes, superpower, exactly, in the military sense, because in Ukraine we have to think about the future, our own military industry, to be more independent, as you said, from the political situation in the West. We see now how dependent the support and the help for Ukraine on the political situation in the European Union, Poland, Slovakia, and other countries. This is unfortunately bad examples. So that's why in the future we should be more autonomous in the military sense. And UK and the United States, they are one of the main our allies in this sector. That's why I think we should be close to NATO, to our allies in Baltic countries, or maybe Black Sea Baltic belt, I would say. And parallelly, we should develop our own industry, military industry.
Now, this is potentially one of the last questions, and perhaps we've saved the most difficult ones to last. There are hard choices to be made when it comes to rebuilding, and some of this might be very politically sensitive. Private capital, for instance, will not be enough to demine and cleanse the environment that has been despoiled by the Russian invasion. That almost certainly will have to come from international institutions and from the government. But there is also potentially a clash between economic logic and security logic in the rebuilding. For instance, the old manufacturing industries in Donbass in the east have been utterly wrecked by the Russian invasion. Surely it's not economically viable to rebuild in exactly the same way. And is there not also logic that Lviv and the western cities are potentially more viable as logistics hubs and as the centers of high-tech industry?
First of all, I want to say that unfortunately the war is still going on. I, as a professional political analyst, I don't believe that the war will stop next year. I don't believe. However, a lot of people think that it will stop. A lot of my colleagues, journalists, political analysts, scientists, they try to persuade me that the war soon will stop. But I don't believe. I prepare myself and prepare my colleagues and the people who are listening that the war can be with a long-term perspective, unfortunately. So we should be ready for the long-term conflict. Yes, theoretically, there could be some kind of temporal pastime agreement, like it was with Minsk agreement, which you mentioned. And the majority of the political analysts in the West, they think now about how to freeze the conflict. But they have forgotten that the conflict we already frozen 9 years ago, 8 years ago. So, what the sense to freeze the conflict now? Just to find more capacity to improve the military possibilities, maybe, yes. But Russia also will use the conflict, the frozen conflict, to improve their own military capacities. So I don't want to analyze all the variants. I also came to UK. I was in European Union. I always asked all leading journalists, politicians, what are the variations of, to stop, to end the conflict. Nobody cannot say something persuasive for me. And I said to them that we should be ready for the long-term conflict. So, if the conflict has a long-term perspective, I think that the question of restoration of Ukraine should be parallelly also very important. We should be prepared for the restoration of Ukraine, for the occupied territories, for the industries which were damaged by Russian aggression, the demining process, the process of I would say organizing the returning of the people from the European Union to Ukraine. So there is a complex of problems which we have to resolve, and they are all depend on the end of the war. But we should be ready now for two things: for the long-term conflict and for the long-term restoration. Both these things, they are important and they are connected. And the biggest thing, the key to understanding of the situation lies the help, the support for Ukraine in the long-term perspective. I mean, in the perspective of the long-term conflict and the restoration of Ukraine depends on our allies, on military support and economical support. We Ukrainians, we are ready. We don't have any fear. Again, I mean, towards the Russian aggression, we don't have fear as some of the Europeans have against Russians. I mean, some countries want to find solutions. Some politicians inside the European Union, they want to find some quick. I don't know how it's possible, but quick solution of this conflict, which has a geopolitical and civilization perspective. Ukrainians do not believe that the quick solution possible. And I think that the Ukrainians are ready for the long-term conflict, but we also need long-term support. And I'm not sure that all West countries are ready for such kind of long-term support. I'm sure that UK is ready for supporting Ukraine long-term. United States, Baltic countries, Scandinavian countries, the majority of European countries. But some countries, they try to be, relatively neutral. As I think that unfortunately we witness the clash of civilizations, and Ukraine is in the middle of this clash, but with all its capacity in West, not in East.
Given what you've just said there about the failure of the media and some analysts to not address the hard questions, should we also not be thinking about what kind of Russia we want to see once they are defeated in this war?
I think there are two possible variants of future Russia, I would say. One, this is long-term war, long-term conflict, by West countries against Russia to destroy Russia as a state in the vision of the current situation, to destroy Russia as a huge state, yes. But a lot of people want to divide, I don't know, Russian territory to destroy not only Putin's regime, Russia as a huge state. There is such kind of tendencies, experts who say this thing. And the other experts, they want transform politically Russian system or Russian political and social reality. I think that both these variants very complicated and hardly to implement, at least quickly. I don't know how to implement. I think we should more thoroughly and more seriously analyze what is happening inside Russia. I think few people understand it. So to understand the Russian vision of inside Russian, how they see it, the ordinary people, to understand who are the elites of Russia, what is whether exists liberal society inside Russia, what is the vision of situation by the Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova, and other countries. So it's a complex of things, and I do believe that the victory of Ukraine will change a lot, will change the vision of Russian citizens of Ukraine and the Russian Federation. It will change the vision of post-Soviet countries of Russia. It will change the West vision of Russia, which sometimes very misunderstanding. So I think the people in the West, they don't understand fully Russian, and the best specialists, unfortunately, the people who so a lot suffer because of the Russian invasion, this is Ukrainians who know Russia very good, unfortunately. That's why we know their possible behavior and what can do. That's why we are actually ready and we don't have any fear.